We've recently seen high mortgage interest rates compared with the last 10 years, and this coupled with increased house prices over the last 10 to 15 years means getting on the housing ladder in the UK is harder than ever. According to the Building Societies Association, first-time buyers are facing the toughest conditions in 70 years to be able to buy a home. One of the initiatives available to help people who are struggling to get onto the property ladder is shared ownership. In this video, I'm going to cover the basics on what shared ownership is and the typical costs, the pros and cons, and the eligibility requirements to buy a property under the shared ownership scheme. If you're new to this channel, I'm Matt. I've been a finance consultant for over 10 years. I now run my own consulting company, and on this channel I talk all things personal finance. So what is shared ownership? Shared ownership is buying part of a property and the other part is owned by a housing association, a local authority or a private developer. The minimum initial share you can buy is typically 25% and the maximum is typically 75%. So on a property valued at £400,000, a 25% share would be equivalent to £100,000 and a 75% share would be equivalent to £300,000. The exact minimum and maximum available shares for purchase vary and very much depends on which property and where you're looking to buy, as well as your financial position. Once you've purchased your shared ownership property, you can buy more share over time. This is called staircasing, where you buy increments of the property up to 100% ownership. For instance, you might want to increase your ownership from 25% to 50% or from 50% to 75%. You can find properties available for shared ownership across the whole of England. To do this, put your details in the 𝐺𝐽.uk website to find out which providers offer shared ownership homes in your area. So what are the typical costs that you would need to consider to buy a shared ownership property? The first is upfront costs to make the purchase, and these include a deposit. Buyers are required to pay a deposit on their share of the property, and it tends to start at 5%. So if you purchase a 25% share in a property valued at £400,000, your share would be £100,000. And if you put down a deposit of 5%, you'd be looking at a £5,000 down payment. These can be substantially less than purchasing a full property, where you're normally required to put down a 10 to 15% deposit. So on the equivalent £400,000 house, you'd be looking at a deposit in excess of £40,000. On top of the deposit amount, there are completion costs, which include solicitor fees. On average, these are around £1,500. And then you've got stamp duty, property tax. The amount you pay here depends on the value of the property and the size of the share of ownership you'd be looking to purchase. The second cost type to consider when buying a shared ownership property is the regular ongoing costs, and these include monthly mortgage repayment costs. For example, if you purchase a 25% share in a £400,000 property with a 5% deposit, you would need a mortgage for £95,000. At an interest rate of 5.5%, your monthly mortgage costs would be £539. On top of your mortgage costs, you also have to pay rent to your landlord for the share of the property that you don't own. If you buy a new build shared ownership property, then the rent limit is 3% of the value of the share that your landlord owns. Most landlords charge around 2.75%, so in the example where you have a 25% share of a £400,000 property, if you were to pay rent of 2.75% on the £300,000 share that your landlord owns, your total rent cost would be £8,250 per year or £688 per month. One thing to note is that if you're able to increase your share of the property gradually, then your rent cost will come down. On top of your mortgage and rent, you also have to pay a service charge for the upkeep and repair of the building and any communal areas such as gardens and hallways. According to Hampton's estate agents, the average monthly service charge for a flat in England is £119 per month. The charge varies by property and the area that you live in, but in many cases it can be nearer to £200 per month. In fact, Hampton's estimated that 20% of leaseholders in London pay a service charge of more than £350 per month. So when budgeting for the monthly costs of a shared ownership property, you need to consider mortgage, rent, service charge, and you also need to factor in monthly utility costs such as gas, electricity, water, the internet and council tax. When weighing up shared ownership, it's important to think about both the financial and non-financial considerations. So what are the pros and cons of shared ownership? Let's start with the pros. Firstly, it enables you to get onto the property ladder and often into a property that you would not normally be able to afford, as the upfront fees and mortgage costs are smaller compared to purchasing full ownership of a property. Secondly, you start paying a contribution to equity in your investment instead of all your monthly housing expenditure going on rent to your landlord. And if the property value increases, you get a share of that profit. So if the property, for example, is sold for £20,000 higher than when you purchased it, and you had a 25% share, you receive £5,000 from the property value increasing. And thirdly, it gives you more control than renting. Landlords can't just give you notice to move out unless you've broken the terms of the shared ownership agreement. This gives you more peace of mind and more stable living. So now let's look at some of the cons of shared ownership. The first is that you get all the negatives of home ownership. Although you may only have 25% or 50% share and you're paying rent, you're still responsible for all the repairs on your property. For example, if an appliance like a boiler or a washing machine breaks down, you don't go 50-50 on the repair. You have to sort it and you have to pay for it. The second is that rent and service charge costs can increase each year. There's been a lot of articles in the media recently about rising service charge costs for shared ownership properties. Most shared ownership agreements include clauses which allow for yearly increases in service charge costs in line with inflation. This has led to some owners feeling trapped living paycheck to paycheck to pay their monthly costs, and they're unable to save any money to either increase their share of the property or save money to be able to move to another property. Third is that the mortgage options are smaller for shared ownership properties. Not all lenders will offer mortgages, and as a result, interest rates can often be higher than the normal mortgage market because there's less competition. Quite often, only putting down a 5% deposit will not be enough to get a good mortgage deal, and sometimes you'll need to put down at least 10 to 15% as a deposit to get a better deal. So this can start to erode the benefits of lower upfront costs when compared to purchasing full ownership of a property. Fourth is that you don't have the same flexibility as full ownership of a property. There are restrictions such as you can't rent out the property because it's supposed to be your primary residence, and often you can't have pets. So that would sadly mean I might not be able to have my pet cat Miko with me. Miko, you're going to smile at the camera. Also, sometimes with shared ownership contracts, you're locked into certain utility providers and you can't change them, which can result in you paying higher monthly bills. It's really important to read your contract to make sure you're comfortable with it before going ahead and buying a shared ownership property. The fifth point is that increasing your share of the property in staircasing can be costly. If the property value increases, and if you wanted to increase your share of the property from 25% to 50%, for example, the amount you would pay would be based on the new value of the property, not the original value. In addition, you'll also charge valuation costs, which have to be carried out by a RICS qualified surveyor and organised by the Housing Association. Sixth is that selling a shared ownership property can be complicated, and there are a smaller number of buyers. If you only have a share of your property, not 100%, selling that share will typically involve the following steps. Firstly, you'll need to give formal notice to the Housing Association of your intention to sell. Secondly, the Housing Association typically has first refusal, i.e. they have the right to try and sell your share of the property themselves. And thirdly, if the Housing Association is unable to find a buyer within the defined period of the shared ownership contract, the responsibility to sell the share will pass back to you. You'll then be able to advertise it via an estate agent, but you'll probably still be restricted to selling the property to someone who fits the shared ownership eligibility criteria. There are less buyers for shared ownership properties compared to the normal property market, so it can take longer to find a buyer and sell the property. To buy a shared ownership property, there is eligibility criteria to meet, and not everyone can. If you're buying in London, your income can't exceed £90,000, and outside London it can't exceed £80,000. That includes combined income, so if you're buying as a couple, you need to be within this limit. You also can't own another property, and you need to be over 18 years old. While the exact eligibility criteria varies by property and area, when you apply, you'll likely be required to demonstrate that you're unable to afford a property which is suitable for your needs on the open market. You'll need a good credit history and not be in any mortgage or rent arrears. you'll need to be accepted for a mortgage on a shared ownership property, and you'll need to have evidence that you have the money available for the upfront fees, including the deposit and completion costs. Whether to buy a shared ownership property or not, ultimately I think comes down to your circumstances and what you want. Shared ownership gives people wanting to get onto the property ladder and freedom away from rent an option and way of doing this in the short term without needing to save up big deposit amounts. However, in my view, it doesn't represent a good long-term financial investment. The high monthly costs with service charge and rent on top of the monthly mortgage payments make it difficult to save any additional money for either investing or to be able to buy another property in the future. I hope this video has been helpful. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments and give the video a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.